Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Wright Hassall's presentation on furlough and the impact on businesses. Yes, the last 12 months or so has been a very challenging time for all of us in every business sector in different ways. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of furlough on businesses and perhaps what businesses may be starting to think about and what they're going to do from this point forward. So the areas I'm going to cover are furlough and the end of the scheme, the changes to furlough in August and September 2021, the final phase and what it may mean for employers, furlough and statutory redundancy, furlough and contractual notice, a furlough and the impact it has on businesses, and perhaps your business and examining your needs for the future. And I'm going to also cover a little bit off about the dreaded R word, redundancy, which is more prevalent in some business sectors than others. So the coronavirus job retention scheme, which is not new to any of us. We've all grappled with it in one way or another. So the word furlough, when I first heard it in March 2020 in the UK, I thought it was an American concept. We don't need to worry about it over here. But little did I know what was about to happen, and I couldn't have been more wrong. So I myself learned a lot about furlough and the implications of it and how to implement it and what it meant for businesses. It was something that was very much in the UK. It was launched on the 20th of April 2020. And the aim of furlough was to keep smaller businesses afloat and to prevent a steep rise in unemployment. The idea was that it helps businesses with the PAYE costs of the scheme to cover staff costs to keep them afloat while trading wasn't permitted in lockdown for some business sectors. And it was intended to avoid the need for redundancy. So between the 20th of April 2020 and the 1st of July 2020, there was full furlough. And thereon, there was a concept called flexible furlough. And we can discuss more about that in the breakout groups, should anybody require to do so. It's estimated the cost of the scheme was £100 billion in terms of taxpayers' burden for the future, no doubt. So we've had various furlough schemes, and we're now on the third furlough scheme, which is currently scheduled to end on the 30th of September 2021. Previously, under the previous schemes that were introduced, employers could claim 80% of an employee's salary, subject to a maximum cap of £2,500 a month. Employers were, however, required to continue paying employees' pension contributions, so they still had a cost and a burden, even though they possibly weren't trading through lockdown. The scheme is now in its reducing stages, with an increasing obligation on employers to pay more and more of an employee's salary and claim less and less from the government. So what are the changes? From the 1st of July 2020 to the 31st of July 2021, from the 1st of July 2021 to the 31st of July 2021, the government had introduced a winding down of the scheme by reducing how much an employer can claim from the government as the restrictions ease in the UK. So in July 2021, employers can only claim 70% of an employee's salary, which has a statutory cap, therefore, of £2,187.50. They must pay employers' NI and pension contributions, but the employee will still receive 80% of their salary, so the employer must top that salary up by 10% to make it up to the 80. So what are the changes from August? So from the 1st of August to the end of the scheme now on the 31st of September 2021, employers can claim 60% of an employee's salary, subject to a maximum cap of £1,875. Again, they must still pay employers' NI and pension contributions, and they are now responsible for topping it up to by 20%. So the employee still receives 80% for the hours they've been furloughed. So they still get up to the £2,500 per month, but not all claimable from the government. Where an employer is using flexible furlough, they have an obligation to obviously pay the normal salary for the hours that the employee works. So what does all of this mean for businesses? Well, businesses have an obligation to continue to pay under the scheme. So they need to understand, employers need to understand their obligations to pay, as a failure to do so could lead to a claim for wrongful dismissal. Hence, if the contractual dues are not paid, employees could sue for breach of contract. Employers need to have a plan of action for what happens when the scheme ends. It is currently anticipated to end on the 30th of September. There is still some uncertainty as to whether furlough may continue beyond that date if there was another national lockdown. However, given the success of the vaccination programme, it appears to provide greater certainty for now to open up businesses and the world because people have the protection of the vaccines, but who knows how long the protection lasts? Who knows if the booster is going to be successful, how long that's going to last? So whilst it does look like the end of furlough, they do say, never say never. And it may be that it's not the end of furlough, but we won't know that at the moment. So employers may want to start to consider whether they need to implement redundancy. On the 20th, in 2020, December 2020, the government announced that employers can't continue to claim contractual notice or statutory notice whilst an employee is on furlough. This would have implications for those employers who are looking to restructure and perhaps make redundancies. Employers also need to consider returning to work plans and policies. So employers are now looking at bringing back employees from a furlough, from home working, and they need to look at whether they have the right policies and procedures in place to allow that to happen. So how do they monitor employees working or continue to work from home? Do they have a hybrid working policy where they will allow employees sometime in the office or the workplace and sometime at home? For the manufacturing industry, obviously, if you're in the manufacturing process and they're operatives, that may not apply. But for management and admin jobs, staff, office jobs, that may need to be something that has to be considered. Alongside that, there are also the flexible working arrangements. The workplace has changed a lot, so employers will need to look at whether flexible working is something that they can offer, how they introduce it, so they're ready for the new workplace normal, and that they can protect their businesses at the same time as offering this flexibility to employees to ensure that the business needs are met and then the employees are all treated equally. So furlough and statutory notice. If an employee has been on furlough during the COVID-19 pandemic, they may have reduced the pay that they received 12 weeks before they were either made redundant or they were terminated for whatever reason. And that may have implications as to what notice pay perhaps is paid to the employee. If they usually work fixed hours, they must be paid their normal full pay while they're on statutory notice, not the reduced furlough rate. If someone's hours or pay varies, then one must take an average of that over the 12 weeks before they are due to be given notice. The employer has to top up any furloughed hours to 100% when calculating notice, so the employee is not out of pocket by the fact that they've been on furlough. If they work variable hours and flexible furlough in 12 weeks, for notice, they have to top up the 80% to the 100%. If they've been working more hours post flexible furlough, just to catch up perhaps with work demands, then an average over the 12 weeks before notice is given has to be taken. So you could end up having to pay more for notice pay where more hours have been worked. And as I said, from the 1st of December 2020, it's no longer possible to claim the notice pay under the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. An employee is entitled to be paid contractual notice for the actual hours that they work. So you have to look at, first of all, you would look at the contract and see what hours they are, what notice they are due to be paid. Statutory notice and contractual notice are very different things. Statutory is the minimum they must get by law. Contractual is what's governed by the contract of employment if it's more than statutory. If the employee leaving has contractual notice and has been on furlough, then the employer would need to check the notice period in the contract because that is what the employee is entitled to. Those employees who have since returned to work after being furloughed get their full normal hours for the pay for the work that they do in their notice period. If they're still on furlough, then an employer would need to check the contract to see what they're entitled to. But generally, they can't claim the furloughed hours. They can claim only the furloughed hours from the government, but they still have to make sure the employee receives 100% of pay. So the employer would then top up the pay to 100%. So this would be costing employers more depending upon how long the notice period is. So what has been the impact of furlough? Well, the impact of COVID on businesses has been varied. Traditional retail and leisure services have suffered very badly, as we all know. Online retail has thrived and tech businesses have generally done very well. And from my understanding, the manufacturing sector has also done particularly well. Obviously, if there's an increase in need for products, then the manufacturing industry would be working as hard as possible to get the demand of those products met. So they may not have used furlough as much as perhaps other business sectors. The effect of the impact of furlough on employees has been to avoid redundancy, and to a large extent from what we're seeing in that respect so far, it has been successful. It's been avoiding redundancy whilst the employee has been obviously paid less than normal, but more than perhaps unemployment benefit would have been. So from that perspective, it would appear that furlough has been a success for employees too. So for the period from March 2020 to May 2021, statistics from the Office of National Statistics show that 11.6 million jobs were supported since the start of the pandemic. The support peaked in May 2020 to 8.9 million before it fell back and then picked up again in late 2020. The number of furlough jobs shrunk to 2.4 million when flexible furlough was introduced in July 2020. So people were back in their roles and they were doing less hours, but still getting paid and still keeping tabs on their job and their skills. Statistics show that more female employees had been placed on furlough than male employees, and that could be because of the childcare arrangements while they were homeschooling. Young people were more likely to be placed on furlough because they obviously worked in the sectors perhaps that were harder hit, like the leisure and retail industries. Hospitality made the highest number of furlough claims for the period November 2020 to the 30th of April 2021. £5.1 billion was spent supporting that sector. So the country's debt levels are the highest they've been in peacetime. It's estimated that the cost of the pandemic will be borne for years to come. So perhaps tax rises or other ways of recouping the amount that's been spent. It will, of course, impact on the economy and its ability to grow, but crucially, people should have been able to be kept in work and being able to return to their roles. So what were the positives of furlough? It was helpful with families with the need to homeschool. although the trade union TUC found 70% of those that needed to be furloughed weren't furloughed. There was no spike in unemployment. Well, not yet. Maybe the end of the furlough scheme may say something different. The longer furlough lasts, the more skills become dated. So that's a negative impact of the furlough scheme. Skills are becoming dated, people's careers perhaps are on hold, and jobs and financial security perhaps aren't as comfortable as they once were in the workplace, and there's a lot of uncertainty for people around jobs, what happens in the future. Do businesses, even if businesses have been doing well during the pandemic, perhaps there's a need to restructure, realign to meet new demands, perhaps that will have an impact too. So in terms of examining your own business, what has changed? Well, the world of work has changed for many people. Many on furlough will face redundancy given the changes to the new normal. Is it the calm before the storm? As employment lawyers, we think it is. Some employees will have been on furlough fully or flexibly for the whole duration of the scheme until it ends on the 30th of September. And a business owner would be saying to themselves, well, if my business can survive 12 months without those employees or those people in those roles, then some employment decisions are going to have to be taken because there's been some cost savings. Is the role being able to be done more efficiently or differently? Will our business take a different form and be perhaps more productive? In which case, some roles perhaps will disappear. In the early days, I can see that furlough was a very sensible provision for businesses to make. But now, with slimmed down businesses, greater efficiencies in the workplace, more use of IT, perhaps business shape will be different for the future and the business needs will be different going forward. So with the benefits of furlough reducing, it's essential for employers to start examining their own businesses. The need to ensure that they're a few steps ahead, because failing to be prepared for the end of furlough can leave an employer vulnerable to employment claims. So perhaps those savings that are made during the furlough process are then quickly diminished if employees start to make claims. So if an employer finds that their workload has diminished in the business, or the business isn't doing so well, or they don't have enough work for the roles, or they need to restructure, then whilst it's not something that's welcomed by employees, redundancy is certainly something that would need to be considered. So is redundancy something to consider? Well, the redundancy requires, the definition of redundancy requires the requirements of a business have either ceased or diminished. So it's possible to make redundancies before furlough ends, although the cost will be borne entirely by the employer. And one case I want to mention to you, a case that actually I saw yesterday, it's a case of the Loving Angels care case. And basically it is only a first instance tribunal decision, but what it actually determined was a failure to furlough somebody can make a dismissal unfair. So in this particular case, the claimant, the employee, was a care assistant. She had just over 2 years service. She worked as live-in care for an elderly lady, but that elderly lady subsequently moved to a care home. Hence, there was no longer a need for someone to provide living care. Quite rightly, the requirements of her role had ceased, and therefore her role was to be made redundant. It seems like a straightforward, normal case that one would determine is a redundancy. It certainly qualifies for redundancy. This lady in May 2020 asked her employer for furlough. They refused. In July 2020, they made her redundant. So the lady then brought a claim for unfair dismissal, and what they determined was, the judge determined in July 2020, a reasonable employer would have furloughed to see if this changed things given time, and the workload perhaps increased. They didn't do that here. So the judge said employers have a duty to actively consider furlough when making someone redundant and where there is no reasonable explanation for not furloughing. In those circumstances, the dismissal is unfair. So the message to employers is furlough scheme is still available until the end of September. So before employers embark on redundancy, they may want to consider whether they can utilise furlough. Now, in this particular case, if you're a furlough geek like I am, you will know that nobody could be furloughed for the first time under the extension to the furlough scheme announced on the 29th of May 2020 if they hadn't previously been furloughed. And this lady hadn't previously been furloughed. So it may be possible that there could be a legal challenge to say, well, if you couldn't be legally furloughed, how could that be an alternative to dismissal? However, it looks like the judge has taken that into account in their deliberations because they say that the relevant date was the date when the lady asked to be furloughed rather than when she was actually made redundant when it wasn't available anymore. So my advice would be, if you are considering restructures and redundancies, which we'll look at in a little bit of detail later, if it's possible to put somebody on furlough first, that may be something you would have to factor in and consider before you simply embark on the redundancy. The overwhelming advice to you would be to take advice before you take any formal steps, of course, because you don't want to be faced with either an unfair dismissal claim or, as is common these days, a claim for a discrimination, which can have unlimited damages. You have to prevent a claim in a redundancy situation by carrying out the process correctly. So what is the potential redundancy process that employers may follow? Well, there are two things that must be done. The first is you must establish a fair reason for dismissal, and then you must follow a fair procedure, and the procedure differs according to the reason. In the circumstances which we're discussing here today, which is furlough, the fair reason would be redundancy, and the fair reason that follows that is going to be as follows. In overview, I've put up on the slide there, you can see that you would identify, first of all, the pool. So you would identify the jobs where there is a diminished need or the need has ceased altogether. In our example of the case I just talked about, it would be the live-in care for the elderly. That would be the role. So everybody who does same or similar work is then pooled together and treated the same. You then have to go through a period of consultation with these employees who are at risk of redundancy. And that varies. It could be a period of 30 days, it could be a period of 45 days, depending upon the number of employees who have been placed at risk of redundancy. It may be that there are no set time periods if you have under 20 employees. It may be that also you need to look at collective consultation and the appointment of representatives and that kind of thing, depending upon if you have collective agreements in place or if you have a recognised trade union. So consultation is very dependent upon the business, and the amount of time it takes is dependent upon the numbers. One of the other things you would need to consider is during the redundancy process is looking at alternatives to redundancy. It could be other jobs. It could be an employee taking lesser hours and less pay. It could be moving into another role. So it could be working part-time. Looking at ways predominantly of avoiding redundancy. One of the other things you would need to do is if you have multiple people in a role, let's say you have 10 operatives and you are now reducing the need from 10 operatives and you only need 6 operatives, there are potentially 4 operatives who will be made redundant. How you select that 4 means you have to have an objective selection criteria, which could be things like length of service, disciplinaries, timekeeping, things that you can look at statistics and data for and justify why you've given the scoring you've given. So you would need to draw up an objective criteria matrix and they would have to be scored, and you would then have your selections for redundancy. That is very much an outline of what you would follow for a correct redundancy process. It isn't the full-blown process. You would have to take independent, tailored advice for your circumstances. It may be a case that you would consider voluntary redundancies. There's no obligation to do so, but it saves a lot of hassle of going through the process and the scoring and the invites and the meetings, if that can be done. People may have heard about settlement agreements, the old compromise agreements. They're now called settlement agreements. If you want to settle a claim with an employee, that can often be offered as an incentive. You would offer the employee some money to enter into an agreement which is legally binding, upon which they have to take legal advice. And essentially what they're doing is waiving their rights in that agreement to take any action out against the employer in relation to their employment or its termination. So it's a safer bet for an employer. So my advice to you would be to plan ahead, to think about the end of furlough, the 30th of September, and to think about what implications may that have on your business now, because you may need to impose flexible furlough. There's no obligation to do so, but you may want to look at furlough ahead of making any decisions about restructure and redundancies. And if you do want to make redundancies, if you have a lengthy consultation process you need to go through or a time period, then unless you plan ahead now, you could be paying employees for a few months after the 30th of September, and all of that would obviously hit the bottom line of any business. The cost of getting it wrong could wipe out the savings that employers make under the furlough scheme. So it is really important that if a company is considering restructures or redundancies, or looking at how to reorganize the business, that they take that advice and avoid the claims. So that's my short gallop through process on redundancy and furlough and the impacts of furlough. I'm happy to take any questions should anybody have any now.
Thank you for that, Suki. It was really informative, and especially the section about redundancies. I think even if manufacturers are no longer utilising the furlough scheme, it's really important to know about how to approach redundancies and looking at all of the options if that is the case. But I have a quick question for you. So if anybody who is still currently utilising the furlough scheme, what will happen after the 30th of September? Will there be any costs that manufacturers will have to consider? You mentioned earlier about they may have to pay wages after the 30th of September. What will that entail?
Yeah, so after the 30th of September, there will be no further, at present, there will be no further support from the government. So furlough will come to an end. Employers will either take their workers back and carry on as they did before, or they will be looking at, we can do without this role, we can restructure this role, we don't need this role, and they'll be looking at potential redundancies. But the cost of all of that will then be borne by the employer themselves. So from the 30th of September, the financial support basically is cut off. People are back on your full wage roll as they normally would be, and that's an exposure and expense for the employer. Or the employer is considering how they're going to restructure their workforce and perhaps don't require those roles, but that will come at the cost of making people redundant, paying redundancy pay, paying notice pay, and also for the period it takes to go through the process, depending on the numbers involved and the agreements in place, they would have to fund those costs for how long it takes to go through the process.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. And in addition to that, will there be, or do you know if there'll be a tax added on for companies if they do have particular people furloughed, or if they did have people furloughed in the past during the pandemic?
So not to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any tax being applied. Obviously, I'm aware that previously there has been a a retention bonus that the government paid if they retained their employees. That was in January, from memory, 2021. So if they made people imposed furlough and then retain those people, they were given a retention bonus. I'm not aware that that is continuing. I'm not aware that there is any tax to be applied or any other consequences for businesses beyond the 30th of September.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for that, Suki. Again, thank you today for the presentation. Really informative. So for anybody that would like to get in touch with Suki, her email and phone number are right there. So I've left that up on the screen just now so that you can take that down. I'll stop sharing the screen now. And yeah, thank you for joining us today, Suki.